Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for joining, accepting our invitation. Today we will talk about, as you know, that we will talk about the Belarus and situation around the Belarus, and also the recent situation in Karabakh war. First, let me start about the Belarus. Why it is important for EU, NATO, and Russia, in your opinion?
Thank you, Nijat, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you. It's great to be here. Shame we have to do it over Zoom. I mean, Belarus is a hugely important country for Europe, for Russia, and for NATO, and the events that are happening there have a huge impact on European security in particular. I'll talk about the security interests first. The reason that Belarus is so important for European security is that it sits really at the crossroads of Europe and Russia. It sits alongside the Baltic states, which and alongside the Suwalki Gap, which has been for a long time been considered to be one of the major strategic vulnerabilities of NATO. The reason for that is that it is a relatively narrow corridor of land, which is the only passage between the Baltic states and the rest of the NATO allies. And on the other side of that corridor is Kaliningrad, which is, of course, the Russian exclave, which Russia also perceives as a particular vulnerability, and is a heavily militarized area within Europe. So it's important because of where it is. There are strategic vulnerabilities in that part of the world, and there is a lot of military assets in that part of the world, and that means that instability in Belarus carries fairly significant security risks for the whole of Europe. For Belarus, and this is important to recognize, Belarus is also incredibly important to Russia historically. And culturally, there are very deep historical and cultural links. People spoke about this with regard to Ukraine back in 2014, and how Russia saw Ukraine as an extension of Russia in some ways, and the same is true for Belarus, if not more so. It's a country which, in Russian national identity narratives, is incredibly close to the Russian nation, and so the future of what happens there is going to be felt in the Kremlin in particular, and in Russia.
The recent standing of the opposition, political opposition, and the people, let's say ordinary people who were really involved recently after such a huge break, involved in politics about the future of the nation or country in Belarus, what can explain to us, I mean, for this uprising, let's say, within the mindsets, also physically demonstrations, what can tell us this situation?
I think that, you know, it's always difficult to put your finger on what brings people out into the streets, and there have been a lot of different reasons put forward by analysts and commentators, and the truth is that there isn't one single reason. Of course, people will be out there for different reasons, particularly for a protest movement like this, where it's heavily decentralized. It's not putting forward any particular policy agenda. So people will be out there for different reasons, and wanting different things in the longer term, and that's important to realize. Why are people out there in such huge numbers on this occasion? That's what really marks the difference between this and previous protests in Belarus, is the scale and the duration. I think one of the most popular reasons which is put forward is the economy. You know, Belarus's economy grew pretty sustainably for most of the post-Soviet period, most of the period of its independence, and since Lukashenko became president. But that has been really that has not been the case since 2014, and there are a lot of reasons for that, which is too difficult to go into now. But there has been pretty significant pressures on Belarus's economy since 2014, and that, of course, means that people have more of a motivation to go out into the streets. The other reason which people have talked about a lot is the coronavirus pandemic and Lukashenko's response to that. Lukashenko was infamous for hugely discounting the threat posed by the virus, really ridiculing it, and effectively suggesting that people should just get on with their lives, and that clearly has damaged his credibility as a leader. It has led people to question whether he really has their best interests at heart, and it's led to a mismatch between their experiences of loved ones falling ill and things like this, and what they're hearing from the government. So it introduces that criticality. And then the third thing is the violence, and we've seen this in other places as well. When the state responds to peaceful demonstrations with violence, it makes people angry, and I think that's an important factor. That the initial response from the government of simply trying to use violence to repress protesters has had the opposite impact and has given people something to rally around.
How long it is required to build up right communication between institutions and people in Belarus?
In terms of building legitimate political institutions.
Yeah.
And so there you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is a huge challenge, and the answer is that it's a long-term and ongoing project. Political institutions don't become legitimate overnight, and they don't stay legitimate because they were created in a legitimate way. And I think that is something which is extremely important for leaders in the West, in particular, to recognise. It is that simply holding free and fair elections or simply changing the leadership will not create trust and legitimacy in the state. It is a contributing factor, and so what we are not going to create or get overnight in Belarus, the day after new elections or the day after a new president is chosen, is huge public confidence and public faith in the political system. That's something that needs to be developed over. I mean, in Western Europe, this process took centuries. And so I think there's a really strong argument actually for saying that what we need to do is to take a patient and evolutionary approach that allows people to build trust and build credibility over time. And to get there, you need transparency, you need responsiveness, all of these things, but they won't happen overnight.
And you talked about my last question about Belarus. And you talked about recognition and legitimacy, and we saw that in the news that recently the UK, EU, and Canada, and also the others applied the sanctions against the particular group of people, and also including Lukashenko. So, what do you think? What can be the possible future impact?
So that's a really good question. Sanctions are difficult policy instruments. I think they are relatively blunt. You can apply them once, and once you've applied them, the only thing you can do is take them off or make them harsher. So you don't have a huge number of options with them. I think symbolically it's important, and that's why the opposition and the protest movement has been so pleased to see this, and why it's difficult to criticize them, because the abuses that have taken place are horrible, and it's right that people should be made accountable for those. The argument is that they will help impose a cost on those in the security agencies, in particular, who are carrying out some of this bad behaviour, and so will get them to change their mind. I personally haven't seen strong evidence that sanctions have a huge impact on behaviour. I don't think there is a good evidence base to suggest that they work in that way as a policy measure. I would be happy to be wrong about that. The risk, I think, with imposing sanctions, particularly on Lukashenko, is that it makes it much more difficult to enter into a dialogue with him or with his administration, and it reduces his options and increases the costs for him of giving up the authority that he has. And I think that's a big risk, because whether you like it or not, Lukashenko is the one that currently controls the state apparatus. And the one thing there is good evidence about in political settlements and in dialogue is that you have to deal with the people who have the power. And my concern with the sanctions that have been imposed and the impact they will have is that if they aren't balanced with a open approach to dialogue with Lukashenko's government, no matter how distasteful that is, then they actually make a peaceful and a stable transition less likely, rather than encouraging it. So I have mixed feelings. Symbolically, I understand them and I think they're important, but I don't think they necessarily will have a positive impact on what happens next.
What has been standing of Russia in the Eastern Partnership countries, especially in the Caucasus, in the framework of the Nagorno-Karabakh, the conflict, do you think what will be in the context of the Western interests connection and the Russian connection? So how you can evaluate the current situation from your, let's say, approach?
So it's a really interesting question, and the reason it's really interesting is because the dynamic of Russian and Western interest in Nagorno-Karabakh is totally different to Russian and Western interests in other parts of the Eastern Partnership. There is no one rule for Russia and Western interests in the Eastern Partnership countries. It's one of the problems with the framework is that every country is very, very different and very unique. But Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia and the West have fairly similar interests with regard to the conflict there. And you've seen that reflected in the statements that have been made, calling for Armenia and Azerbaijan both to declare ceasefires, return to the negotiating table, and that reflects they actually do have a shared interest here in maintaining stability and avoiding an escalation in the conflict. In a way that they don't necessarily have in such a clear-cut way in other countries. Russia wants to balance its relationships with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia, of course, is a member of the Common Treaty Security Organization.
Yeah.
So Russia has a military alliance with Armenia, but it has been recently building closer relationships with the Azeri government. And it sells arms to Azerbaijan. So really, Russia does not want to be drawn into this conflict. This is not a conflict that Russia wants to be drawn into. And because of Armenia and its relationship with Armenia, it could be. The Western interests, I mean, in general, the West has an interest in avoiding conflict and instability. It's a declared policy objective. It particularly has an interest in that in Armenia and Azerbaijan because of the energy assets in the region, the gas pipelines and commercial interests in Azerbaijani.
Do you have any visibility about the future of this the war? And do you think the result, a solution, will be on the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan?
So that's an interesting question. As you rightly said, I'm not an expert in this region, and so before I answer, what I will say is that the ELN soon will be publishing some responses from some of our members who have more expertise on this area than I do. So I would encourage you to go and read those and perhaps speak to them once they do come out. But I mean, my perspective on this from slightly further away is in terms of the dynamics between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what settlement they might reach, or whether there is a military outcome here. I don't know enough about the region to be able to give you an answer on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah.